Down to her last $1,800 and facing eviction from her apartment, single mom Sarah Mitchell made a desperate decision to buy a dilapidated farm at a county auction that no one else wanted. What she discovered hidden beneath the old barn would not only change her life forever, but would uncover a Cold War secret that had been buried for over 60 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell stared at her bank account balance on her phone screen. $1,242.17. Just 18 months ago, she had been a respected accountant at a successful firm in Chicago with a comfortable condo, a reliable car, and enough savings to feel secure as a single mother raising her 12-year-old daughter Emma. Now at 36, she was unemployed, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Milwaukee and counting pennies just to keep the lights on. The accounting firm had downsized after losing several major clients, and Sarah, being one of the newer hires, had been among the first to go. She'd found temporary work since then, but nothing stable, and certainly nothing that paid enough to maintain their previous lifestyle. The severance package had sustained them for a while, but medical bills from Emma's unexpected appendectomy had drained what little remained of their safety net. "We'll figure it out, Mom," Emma had said that morning, wise beyond her years, as she noticed Sarah counting coins from their emergency jar to pay for gas. "We always do." Sarah had forced a smile, not wanting her daughter to see the fear that had been her constant companion for months. The eviction notice taped to their door yesterday had made it clear they had 2 weeks to come up with 3 months of back rent, or they would be homeless just as Wisconsin's harsh winter was setting in. As she sat in her aging Honda outside the Lakeside County Courthouse, Sarah noticed a flyer for an upcoming property auction. Most of the listings were for foreclosed homes with starting bids well beyond her means, but one caught her eye. A 40-acre farm property with a dilapidated farmhouse and barn just outside the small town of Meadowbrook, about 30 miles from Milwaukee. The minimum bid was listed as $1,500. Sarah had grown up in a rural community before moving to Chicago to pursue her career. She had basic knowledge of gardening and animal care from spending summers on her grandparents' farm, though she had sworn she would never return to that lifestyle. She had escaped to the city for a reason, for opportunities, for culture, for the dreams she had once believed were within reach. But now, with her options evaporating and winter approaching, even a rundown farmhouse seemed better than living in their car. The next day, Sarah arranged for Emma to stay with a friend after school and drove to the auction. She arrived early, studying the property details and photos. Cedar Ridge Farm, as it was called, showed a weathered 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint, several broken windows, and an overgrown yard. The red barn listed noticeably to one side, its paint faded to a dull pink. The listing mentioned no updated plumbing, outdated electrical wiring, possible structural issues, and land. Untended for 5 years. Not surprisingly, when the auctioneer called for bids, the room remained silent. "Paid $500, Sarah called out, her voice trembling slightly. A few heads turned in surprise, but no competing bids followed. "Going once, going twice. Sold to the lady in the blue jacket," the auctioneer announced, seeming almost apologetic. As Sarah signed the paperwork and handed over nearly every dollar she had left, the county clerk looked at her with a mixture of pity and confusion. "You know, Ms. Mitchell, there's a reason no one wanted that place," she said quietly. "The Jenkins farm has been abandoned since old Harold passed away 5 years ago. He was, well, let's just say he wasn't well liked around here. Some folks say that property has bad energy." Sarah forced a smile. "I don't believe in bad energy, just bad luck, and mine's about to change." But as she drove the 30 miles to her new property, doubt began to creep in. What had she done? She knew little about serious home repair or farming. She had just spent her last dollars on a property that might be beyond saving. And how would Emma react to being uprooted from her school and friends to move to a derelict farmhouse in the middle of nowhere? When she finally turned onto the long gravel driveway, the reality of her purchase hit her full force. The farmhouse stood on a small hill, silhouetted against the grey autumn sky, looking even more desolate than in the photos. The roof sagged in places, the porch steps were rotting, and the fields that stretched out behind the house were overgrown, with weeds and small saplings. A once charming apple orchard had grown wild, the trees gnarled and unpruned. "What have I gotten myself into?" she whispered as she parked her car and stepped out into her new life, armed with nothing but a flashlight. And what little courage she had left. Sarah pushed open the front door, which creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath her feet. The wallpaper, once probably cheerful, with a pattern of small blue flowers, now hung in tattered strips, revealing the plaster beneath. In what must have been the living room, a moth-eaten armchair and a broken rocking chair remained, as if the previous owner had left in a hurry. The kitchen was in no better shape, with rusted appliances from at least 40 years ago, and cabinets hanging off their hinges. Sarah shined her flashlight upstairs, where a narrow staircase led to what she assumed were bedrooms. She was too exhausted to explore further that night. Instead, she returned to her car, noting that she would need to come back tomorrow with cleaning supplies, sleeping bags, and whatever food she could afford before bringing Emma to see their new home. As she got into her car, she noticed a figure watching from the neighboring property. A tall, weathered man in his 60s stood by a fence line, observing her with undisguised interest. Sarah gave a tentative wave, but the man turned and walked back toward a well-maintained farmhouse in the distance. The drive back to their apartment was filled with Sarah's conflicting emotions. What would she tell Emma? How could she make this work? Had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? The next morning, Sarah woke before dawn, determined to be positive when she broke the news to her daughter. To her surprise, Emma's reaction was far from the horror Sarah had expected. "Our own farm? Like, with animals and everything?" Emma's eyes widened with excitement. "Well, eventually maybe," Sarah hedged. "It needs a lot of work first. It's not in great shape." "But it's ours, really ours." "Yes, sweetheart, it's ours." Emma threw her arms around Sarah. "This is going to be amazing, Mom. I've always wanted to live somewhere with space. Can I have chickens and maybe a goat?" Sarah laughed, relief washing over her. "Let's focus on making the house livable first. We need to go there today and start cleaning, so we can move in this weekend." They spent the day gathering supplies, cleaning products, basic tools, sleeping bags, a camping stove, and as many groceries as Sarah could afford with the $42 left in her account. By afternoon, they were pulling up the gravel driveway, Emma's, face pressed against the window in anticipation. "It's like in that book we read, Mom. The one where the family moves to the country and fixes up the old house," Emma said, her enthusiasm undimmed by the property's obvious state of disrepair. Together they entered the farmhouse, Emma exploring each room with the resilience of youth, seeing potential where Sarah had only seen problems. "This can be my room," Emma declared, claiming a small bedroom with faded yellow walls and a window that overlooked the apple orchard. "And look, there's a window seat." By evening, they had swept out years of dust from the kitchen and one bedroom, scrubbed the ancient but functional cast-iron sink, and set up a makeshift camp in the living room with their sleeping bags. The electricity worked, though many outlets didn't, and the water ran from the taps, though it came out rusty at first. As they sat on the porch steps, eating sandwiches and watching the sunset over their land, despite everything, there was something satisfying about that thought. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. Tomorrow we'll explore the barn, she told Emma. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And I need to figure out how to fix that broken window before it gets any colder. That night, as they lay in their sleeping bags on the dusty living room floor, Emma fell asleep quickly, excited about their new adventure. Sarah, however, lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house, the wind whistling through cracks in the windows and the occasional scurrying that suggested mice had made themselves at home long before the Mitchells arrived. Morning came with a shaft of sunlight through the broken living room window, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. Sarah woke stiff and sore, but with renewed determination. She had made her choice, and now she had to make it work, for Emma's sake, if not for her own. They spent the day taking inventory of the property. The farmhouse, while dilapidated, had good bones. The roof needed work, but wasn't beyond repair. The plumbing was ancient, but functional. The electrical system would need updating, but that could wait. There was a well on the property that, once cleaned out, could provide water if the municipal supply ever failed. The barn, though sagging in places, could still serve its purpose once shored up. The fields were overgrown, but not ruined. With work, a lot of work, this place could be productive again. By evening, Sarah had cleared enough debris from the kitchen to make it somewhat functional and had swept one of the bedrooms clean enough to move their sleeping bags upstairs. She had also discovered a generator in a shed that miraculously still worked with a bit of tinkering. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As night fell again, Sarah sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset over her land. Emma beside her chattering about her plans for a vegetable garden next spring. "Do you think the neighbors are nice?" Emma asked, pointing toward the property where Sarah had seen the man watching her the day before. "I don't know, sweetie. We haven't met them yet." As if on cue, the sound of a truck engine rumbled up the driveway. The same tall, weathered man she had seen yesterday was driving an old blue Ford pickup. He parked near the house and stepped out, carrying a cardboard box. "Evening," he called as he approached. "Figured you folks might need some basics. Name's Frank Cooper. Own the farm next door." He set the box down on the porch steps. Sarah could see it contained some light bulbs, candles, matches, a few canned goods, and a loaf of fresh bread. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, extending her hand, "and this is my daughter Emma. Thank you for the welcome." Frank nodded, his expression remaining guarded as he shook her hand. Cedar Ridge Farm's been sitting empty for 5 years now. Not many folks would take on a project like this. "The price was right," Sarah said with a small smile. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mind if I ask what brought you all the way out here? Not many single mothers looking to take on an old farm like this?" The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Frank's tone made Sarah cautious. "Needed a fresh start," she said simply. "The city wasn't working out for us anymore." Frank studied her for a moment. "Harold Jenkins wasn't much of a farmer," he said finally. "Bought this place back in the 50s, but spent more time in that barn than tending crops. Always seemed to have visitors from the government, though people wondered about that." Sarah's interest piqued. "The government? What kind of government?" Frank shrugged. "Men in suits, very official looking, came regularly for years, then suddenly stopped in the 70s. Harold kept to himself after that. Became something of a hermit." He paused, studying Sarah's face. "You remind me of someone. Ever been to this area before?" "No," Sarah said. "Never." Frank held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Well, just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. Word of advice, this place has a history. Might be best to leave some stones unturned." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and if you need help with anything practical, fixing that roof before winter or getting that well working again, my number's on the mailbox at the end of my drive." He glanced at Emma, then back at Sarah. "Though I suspect you might be getting other visitors soon enough." With that cryptic comment, Frank walked back to his truck, leaving Sarah standing on the porch with a growing sense of unease. "He seems nice," Emma said, already digging through the box of supplies. "Look, Mom, real bread." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Frank Cooper knew something about Cedar Ridge Farm that she didn't, something that had prompted his warning about leaving stones unturned. It wasn't until the third day that Sarah ventured into the barn. She had been avoiding it, partly because the structure looked unstable and partly because the thought of what might be living in there, raccoons, possums, or worse, was unsettling. But curiosity finally got the better of her, especially after Frank's comments about Harold spending more time in the barn than farming. With a crowbar clutched in one hand and a flashlight in the other, Sarah carefully approached the listing structure. Emma was occupied inside, setting up her bedroom with treasures she'd found in the attic, old books, a small wooden rocking chair, and a handmade quilt that, once washed, would be perfectly usable. The barn door hung precariously on rusted hinges. Sarah pushed it open slowly, wary of the entire thing collapsing. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through holes in the roof. Old farming equipment sat rusting in corners, a plow, various hand tools, and what looked like parts of a tractor. Hay bales, long since rotted to dust, left rectangular outlines on the floor. But what caught Sarah's attention was the unusual concrete floor. Most old barns had dirt or wooden floors, but this one had been paved with concrete, cracked and stained, but definitively not original to a farm structure of this age. Sarah moved carefully across the space, noting that despite the barn's external appearance of neglect, the interior showed signs of having been used relatively recently. There were scrape marks on the floor where something heavy had been moved, and in one corner, a workbench held tools that weren't nearly as rusted as the farm implements. As she examined the concrete floor more closely, she noticed something odd, a section near the back wall that seemed different from the rest. The color was slightly off, and the concrete appeared newer. Curiosity piqued, Sarah tapped it with her crowbar, producing a distinctly hollow sound. Heart racing, she examined the edges of the section and found a nearly invisible seam running in a perfect square, about 4 feet on each side. There was no handle, no obvious way to lift it, but Sarah was now convinced it was some kind of trap door. She worked the tip of the crowbar into the seam and pushed down hard. The concrete section shifted slightly, but didn't open. Encouraged, she tried again from a different angle. This time, she felt something give way, a locking mechanism releasing. And one edge of the concrete square popped up just enough for her to get her fingers underneath. With considerable effort, Sarah lifted the heavy trapdoor, revealing a set of steel stairs descending into darkness. A cool draft of air wafted up from below, carrying a musty metallic smell. Sarah hesitated, staring down into the darkness. Whatever was down there had been deliberately hidden. Did she have the right to explore it? What if it was something dangerous, chemicals, weapons, or some other hazard she shouldn't expose her daughter to? But the farm was hers now, and she needed to know what she had purchased. Taking a deep breath, Sarah switched on her flashlight and began to descend the stairs. They led to a small underground room, perhaps 15 feet square, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. The space was surprisingly clean and dry for an underground chamber, suggesting it had been designed for long-term use. Metal shelving units lined the walls, mostly empty now, but with a few abandoned items, some empty binders, office supplies, and what looked like old radio equipment. In the center of the room stood a metal desk with a single drawer, locked with a small key. On top of the desk sat an old rotary telephone, disconnected, and a metal box about the size of a shoebox. The box was locked with a simple padlock. Sarah looked around for a key, but found none. Determined, she went back upstairs, retrieved a hammer from her car, and returned to break the lock. Inside the box, she found several items carefully preserved. In plastic, a leather-bound notebook, a stack of manila envelopes stamped classified, several microfilm reels, and most surprisingly, a sealed letter addressed simply to the inheritor of Cedar Ridge. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the letter first. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, then you've discovered what many have sought. My name is Harold Jenkins, though that is not the name I was born with. I was a scientist with the Department of Defense during the Cold War, stationed at a facility known only as the Meadow Project. Cedar Ridge Farm was never truly a farm, but a cover for one of several monitoring stations established throughout the Midwest in the 1950s. Beneath this barn lies the entrance to a much larger facility extending under the property, designed to survive nuclear attack and serve as a communication hub in the event of war with the Soviet Union. What made our station unique, however, was not its communications capability, but the research conducted here. Research that, if revealed, would force a re-examination of much of America's early Cold War strategy. The enclosed documents and microfilm contain evidence of unauthorized, experimental programs, their targets, and their outcomes. I have kept these records safe for decades, uncertain whether they should ever see the light of day. Now, as my life draws to a close, I leave this decision to you. Study the materials carefully before deciding. There are powerful interests who would prefer these secrets remain buried forever. The entrance to the main facility is concealed behind the north wall of this room. The access code is 478961. Whatever you decide, proceed with caution. Once certain doors are opened, they cannot be closed again. Harold Jenkins, formerly Dr. Henry Jacobson, April 17, 2013. Sarah sat back against the desk, the letter clutched in her hand. What had she stumbled into? Secret government facilities, classified documents, Cold War experiments. It sounded like the plot of a thriller novel, not something that should exist beneath a dilapidated barn in rural Wisconsin. She carefully opened the notebook. Inside were meticulously detailed notes, diagrams, and observations dating from 1952 to 1974. The handwriting was cramped but precise, documenting what appeared to be some kind of long-term research project involving radio frequencies, atmospheric conditions, and their effects on human psychology. Sarah flipped through the pages, catching phrases that sent chills down her spine. Subjects remain unaware of influence. Targeted behavioral modifications successful in 73% of test population. Meadowbrook continues to provide optimal isolation. For Phase 3. Meadowbrook, the very town she had just moved to. As Sarah continued to read through the notebook, the gravity of her discovery deepened. The entries became increasingly disturbing, detailing a program called Operation Echo that had apparently used Meadowbrook as an unwitting test site for experimental psychological techniques. According to the notes, the government had selected the town due to its geographic isolation and stable population, a perfect closed system to monitor results over decades. She set the notebook aside and examined one of the manila envelopes. Inside were photographs, aerial views of Meadowbrook from the 1950s, pictures of equipment installations, and most disturbingly, surveillance photos of town gatherings with certain individuals circled in red. On the back of each photo was a code and date. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up another envelope, this one containing personnel files for the scientists assigned to Cedar Ridge Station. She froze when she came to a file with a familiar name, Dr. Richard Mitchell, lead atmospheric physicist, 1953-1965. Mitchell, her maiden name. The photo showed a serious-looking man in his 30s with a high forehead and the same deep-set eyes Sarah saw in the mirror every day. Eyes that Emma had inherited. This man was unmistakably related to Her, though she had never seen him before. Sarah's grandfather had died before she was born, and her father had never spoken much about him except to say he had been a government scientist who died of a heart attack. The family history had always been vague, with her father changing the subject whenever she asked for details. The sound of footsteps on the barn floor above startled Sarah out of her thoughts. "Mom, are you in here?" Emma's voice called. Sarah quickly gathered the materials, stuffing them back into the metal box. "Down here, honey. I found a cellar or something. Stay up there. The stairs might not be safe for both of us." Cool. A secret room. Emma's excited face appeared at the top of the stairs. "Kind of," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just checking for anything useful. I'll be right up." Sarah tucked the metal box under her arm and climbed back up to the barn, closing the trapdoor behind her. She would have to examine the rest of the contents later when Emma was asleep, and she would definitely need to decide what to do about the apparent larger facility that Harold claimed lay behind the north wall of the room. "Did you find anything awesome?" Emma asked, eyes bright with curiosity. "Just some old papers," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Nothing interesting. But I think this barn might be more stable than it looks from outside. The foundation is solid concrete." That evening, after they had eaten a simple dinner and Emma had fallen asleep, Sarah returned to the metal box. She spread the contents across the kitchen table and began a more methodical examination. The microfilm reels would be useless without a reader, but the classified documents told a chilling story. Operation Echo had been an early Cold War program designed to test the effectiveness of low-frequency radio transmissions on community behavior. Cedar Ridge Farm had housed specialized equipment that broadcast signals to Meadowbrook, while scientists monitored the town for changes in voting patterns, consumer habits, and social dynamics. According to the reports, the program had been officially terminated in 1974 when congressional oversight threatened to expose it. The facility had been decommissioned, the equipment allegedly removed, and the property transferred to Harold Jenkins, Dr. Henry Jacobson's cover identity, as part of his retirement package in exchange for his silence. But Harold's notes suggested something more disturbing: that elements of the program had continued unofficially, that some equipment remained operational beneath the farm, and that certain effects on the townspeople had become permanent, possibly even hereditary. The final pages of his notebook contained calculations, maintenance logs dating until 2010, and increasingly paranoid observations about being watched by them, whoever had taken over monitoring the project after its official termination. Sarah sat back, her mind reeling. If any of this was true, it meant the government had experimented on an entire town for decades. It meant her grandfather had been involved. And it suggested that something much larger than a small concrete room lay beneath her property. Something that might still be active. As she contemplated this unsettling possibility, she heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the driveway. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting at this hour? Sarah quickly gathered the documents and hid the metal box in a kitchen cabinet. Through the window, she saw a black SUV with government plates parking near the house. A middle-aged woman in a dark suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. Sarah's heart raced. Had she triggered some kind of alarm by opening the trap door? Was the underground facility still monitored? She considered not answering the door, but the woman had already seen the lights on in the house. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the porch. "Ms. Mitchell?" the woman asked, her voice professionally neutral. "I'm Agent Diana Winters, Department of Energy. I apologize for the late hour, but we've been notified of an access event at this property." "Access event?" Sarah repeated, trying to sound confused. Agent Winters' expression remained impassive. "This property is flagged in our system. When certain areas are accessed, we're automatically notified. You've recently purchased Cedar Ridge Farm, correct? Yes, at the county auction, Sarah replied. I wasn't aware the Department of Energy had any interest in it. The DOE maintains oversight of numerous legacy sites from previous decades, Winters explained. This property contains certain infrastructure that requires periodic monitoring. May I come in? Sarah hesitated, acutely aware of Emma sleeping upstairs and the incriminating documents hidden in the kitchen. It's very late, and my daughter is asleep. Perhaps we could speak tomorrow. I'm afraid this is somewhat urgent, Ms. Mitchell. Winter's tone remained polite but firm. It shouldn't take long. Reluctantly, Sarah stepped aside to let the agent enter. They sat at the kitchen table, the very place where minutes earlier Sarah had been examining classified Cold War documents. Ms. Mitchell, when you purchased this property, you should have been informed of certain restrictions regarding ground, disturbance and structural modifications, Winters began. There was nothing in the sale documents about restrictions, Sarah replied truthfully. Winters frowned. That's unfortunate. This property contains monitoring equipment for groundwater, contamination from a 1960s research facility. The equipment is harmless, but must remain undisturbed. She opened her briefcase and removed a folder. I have the proper disclosure forms here, which should have been provided at sale. They outline the restricted areas and the government's right of access for maintenance. Sarah skimmed the document Winters slid across the table. It described environmental monitoring equipment installed in the sub-basement level of the barn and imposed limitations on excavation or construction within 50 feet of the structure. What kind of research facility was here? Sarah asked, watching Winters carefully. Agricultural research, primarily, Winters replied smoothly. Experimental fertilizers that were later discontinued. Nothing dangerous, but the monitoring is standard protocol for any site with potential groundwater. Impacts. It was a plausible explanation, but it didn't match the documents Sarah had just read, or Harold Jenkins' letter. This was a cover story. I found a concrete room beneath the barn today, Sarah said, deciding to test the waters. It didn't look like environmental monitoring equipment. A flicker of something, concern, alarm, passed across Winter's face before her professional mask returned. That would be the access point for the monitoring system. It's important that you don't disturb any equipment you might find there. Some of it operates on battery systems that could pose a hazard if mishandled. Sarah nodded slowly. And the larger facility behind the north wall. Is that part of the monitoring system too? This time, Winters couldn't fully conceal her reaction. Her eyes widened slightly, and she sat straighter in her chair. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Ms. Mitchell. The monitoring installation is self-contained in the room you discovered. That's strange, Sarah said, maintaining eye contact. The previous owner left some notes suggesting otherwise. Mr. Jenkins suffered from declining mental health in his later years, Winters said carefully. His perceptions weren't always reliable. Whatever notes you found should be taken with considerable skepticism. I see, Sarah replied. And Dr. Richard Mitchell's involvement? Was that also a product of Harold's imagination? At the mention of Sarah's grandfather, Winters abruptly closed her folder and returned it to her briefcase. Ms. Mitchell, I'm not at liberty to discuss historical personnel matters. What I can tell you is that this property contains sensitive government equipment that must remain undisturbed. Interfering with it could result in both civil and criminal penalties. She stood, clearly intending to end the conversation. I'll need you to sign these disclosure forms, acknowledging the restrictions. A team will arrive tomorrow to secure and update the monitoring equipment. They'll need unrestricted access to the barn. And if I refuse, Sarah asked. Winter's smile didn't reach her eyes. The easement rights are attached to the property deed, regardless of your acknowledgement. but refusing cooperation would certainly complicate your situation unnecessarily. She paused, especially for a single mother starting over after financial difficulties. The implied threat hung in the air between them. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. How much did they know about her? Had they been watching since the moment she purchased the farm? "I'll need to review the documents with my lawyer before signing anything," Sarah said, buying time. "Of course," Winters replied. "But the maintenance team will still require access. Tomorrow, shall we say 9 a.m.? After Winters left, Sarah stood at the window watching the black SUV disappear down the driveway. Her mind raced through the implications of what had just happened. The government, or some faction within it, was clearly still interested in whatever lay beneath Cedar Ridge Farm. Winters' explanation about environmental monitoring was obviously a cover story, and they were coming back tomorrow. Sarah glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1 a.m. She had to decide quickly what to do next. If she wanted to discover the truth about the facility and her grandfather's involvement, she needed to act before the maintenance team arrived to secure the site. Moving quietly to avoid waking Emma, Sarah grabbed a flashlight, the barn, key, and Harold's letter with the access code. She slipped out of the house and hurried to the barn, painfully aware that she might be under surveillance even now. Inside, she quickly located the trapdoor and descended into the concrete room. Following Harold's instructions, she examined the north wall carefully, eventually finding a nearly invisible seam outlining a door-sized rectangle. There was no handle, no obvious locking mechanism, but in the corner of the rectangle, she discovered a small panel that slid aside to reveal a numeric keypad. With trembling fingers, Sarah entered the code from Harold's letter, 478961. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard a series of mechanical clicks as locks disengaged, and the section of wall slowly swung inward on hidden hinges. Beyond lay darkness, a darkness that smelled of stale air, metal, and secrets long buried. Sarah shined her flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow corridor with metal walls. Emergency lights activated automatically as the door opened, bathing the passage in dim red illumination. She hesitated at the threshold. Once she stepped through, there would be no going back. Whatever she discovered would change everything. For her, for Emma, and possibly for the people of Meadowbrook if Harold's notes were accurate. Drawing a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward into the facility. The corridor extended about 30 feet before opening into a larger space. As Sarah moved forward, motion sensors triggered overhead lights that flickered reluctantly to life, revealing what appeared to be a command center straight out of a Cold War film. Banks of equipment lined the walls. Radar displays, radio consoles, massive early-generation computers with reel-to-reel tape drives. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but to Sarah's surprise, small status lights glowed green on several units. Despite appearances, some of this equipment was still functioning. A large situation table dominated the center of the room, with a detailed map of Meadowbrook and the surrounding county etched into its surface. Small LED lights embedded in the map blinked at various locations throughout the town. Sarah approached one of the active consoles. The screen displayed a cycling series of data readouts, frequency patterns, power levels, and what appeared to be some kind of effectiveness metrics for different regions of the town. One heading particularly caught her eye: generational susceptibility analysis. Moving to another station, she found file cabinets filled with records, subject profiles, test results, and long-term observation reports. The most recent entries were dated just 3 years ago, long after the program had supposedly ended. In a separate room, she discovered what appeared to be a broadcasting center, with sophisticated antenna controls and transmission equipment. Unlike the command center, this room showed signs of more recent use. The dust was less thick, and several modern components had been integrated into the older systems. The final room, Sarah explored, contained rows of film canisters, hard drives, and backup tapes, an archive of what appeared to be decades of surveillance and experimental data. As she examined the materials, one thing became increasingly clear. Operation Echo had never truly shut down. It had evolved, gone deeper underground, and continued its work with a smaller, more secretive team. And based on the equipment still functioning, some aspect of the operation remained active to this day. Sarah found a logbook with entry records near what appeared to be the main entrance to the facility, a heavy blast door that presumably led to another access point elsewhere on the property. The most recent entry was dated just 1 month ago. Quarterly maintenance and data collection complete. Transmission patterns adjusted per new protocol, awaiting confirmation of Phase 7 approval. With growing horror, Sarah realized that the town of Meadowbrook and its residents, including now her and Emma, were still unwitting subjects in whatever experiment had begun in the 1950s. She needed proof, something she could take with her, something that would convince others if necessary. Sarah quickly gathered several of the more recent logbooks, a handful of data tapes that looked compatible with modern computers, and photographs of the facility. She found a dusty canvas bag in a storage locker and filled it with her evidence. As she prepared to leave, Sarah noticed something she had overlooked, a framed photograph on what appeared to be the facility director's desk. She wiped away the dust and felt her heart skip a beat. The picture showed a group of men in lab coats standing in front of Cedar Ridge Farm when it was new. In the center stood her grandfather, Richard Mitchell, his arm around the shoulders of a man she recognized from the personnel files as Harold Jenkins Henry Jacobson. But what struck Sarah most was the strong family resemblance. In the right light, Richard Mitchell could have been her father, just as she sometimes glimpsed her father's features in Emma's face. This was undeniable proof of her connection to this place, to whatever had happened here. She added the photograph to her bag and made her way back to the entrance. As she prepared to seal the facility, a question nagged at her. If the government was still maintaining this place, still running whatever program her grandfather had helped create, why had they allowed the farm to be sold at public auction? Why risk someone like her discovering their secret? Unless they hadn't expected it to be purchased, unless they had planned to acquire it themselves before someone else could. But Sarah's impulsive bid had disrupted their timeline. Or a more disturbing thought, unless they had somehow engineered her purchase of the property. Had she been guided here? Was her financial collapse, her desperate situation, somehow part of a larger design? Sarah shook her head, trying to dispel the paranoid thoughts. That was impossible. No one could have predicted she would happen to. See that auction notice, happen to have just enough money for the minimum bid. Could they? She sealed the facility, returned to the concrete room, and closed the hidden door. As she prepared to climb the stairs back to the barn, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. Car tires on gravel coming up the driveway. Sarah quickly ascended the stairs, closed the trapdoor, and rushed to the barn door. Through a crack, she could see another black SUV parking beside the house. It was 3 a.m., far too early for the maintenance team Winters had mentioned. 2 men in dark clothing emerged from the vehicle and approached the house quietly. Their manner was not that of official government agents making an announced visit. Sarah's pulse raced. Emma was alone in the house, sleeping and vulnerable. She had to get back there, but crossing the open yard would expose her to whoever had arrived. She needed a distraction. Looking around the barn, Sarah spotted an old tractor that had been cannibalized for parts. Its battery was long dead, but its fuel tank might still contain something flammable. Working quickly, she found a rag, stuffed it into the fuel tank opening, and used her lighter to set it aflame. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The ancient fuel ignited with a whoosh, sending flames shooting upward. Not enough to burn down the barn, The tank contained too little for that, but certainly enough to draw attention. The men spun toward the barn as Sarah slipped out the side door and circled around to approach the house from the rear. She could hear them shouting to each other as they ran toward the fire. Sarah entered through the back door and rushed upstairs to Emma's room. Her daughter was sitting up in bed, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, what's happening? I heard a car." "We need to go, sweetie," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice calm. "Right now, grab your shoes and coat." "But it's the middle of the night." "I know, but it's important. I'll explain later." Sarah was already stuffing Emma's essentials into a backpack. "We're going to play a game, okay? We need to leave without anyone seeing us." Emma, sensing the urgency in her mother's voice, nodded and quickly put on her shoes. Sarah led her down the back stairs and out through the kitchen door, keeping low and using the overgrown shrubs for cover. The men were still occupied with the fire in the barn, which had grown larger than Sarah intended. They had called for backup on their radios, their attention fully focused on containing the blaze before it could spread to whatever lay beneath. Sarah and Emma made it to the car, which Sarah had fortunately parked behind the house rather than in the main driveway. She started the engine and drove across the backfield, headlights off, following a rough track that led toward Frank Cooper's neighboring farm. "Mom, you're scaring me," Emma whispered as they bounced across the uneven ground. "What's going on? Who were those men?" "I'm not entirely sure," Sarah answered truthfully. "But I think they're interested in something at our farm, something that might be dangerous." She glanced at her daughter's frightened face and added, "It's going to be okay. We just need to talk to someone who can help us figure this out." They reached Frank Cooper's driveway and turned onto it, gravel crunching beneath their tires. Lights came on in the farmhouse as they approached. Frank appeared on the porch, shotgun in hand, obviously alerted by the sound of a vehicle at this unusual hour. Sarah stopped the car and rolled down her window. "Mr. Cooper, it's Sarah Mitchell from next door. We need help." Frank lowered the shotgun but didn't set it aside. "What kind of help? And what's that fire over at your place?" "That's part of what we need help with," Sarah said. "There are men at our farm. They didn't identify themselves, and they came in the middle of the night. I think they're looking for something." Frank's expression darkened. "They've come back then, sooner than I expected." He gestured toward his house. "Come inside, quickly." Once inside, Frank bolted the door and closed all the curtains. His home was cozy but Spartan, the residence of a man who lived alone and cared little for decoration. He ushered them into the kitchen and put on a kettle for tea. "You found something in the barn," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Frank might be their only ally at the moment, but his earlier cryptic warnings made his own position unclear. "Why did you tell me to leave some stones unturned?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. Frank sighed heavily and sat down at the kitchen table. "Because I watched what happened to Harold Jenkins when he started asking questions. 20 years of harassment, surveillance, mysterious accidents. They made his life hell because he knew too much and wouldn't stay quiet." "Who are they?" Sarah pressed. "Started as regular government, Defense Department, I think. Now? I'm not sure even they know anymore. Operation Echo took on a life of its own. Became something autonomous, self-perpetuating." Frank glanced at Emma, who was listening intently, and lowered his voice. "They've been experimenting on this town for 70 years, Ms. Mitchell. Generations of citizens as unwitting lab rats." "You know about Operation Echo?" Sarah asked, surprised. Frank's bitter laugh held no humor. "Harold and I served together in Korea. When he came back and took this strange job at a farm that never grew anything, I got suspicious, started watching, gathered information over decades." He shook his head. "By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late. To stop it, what exactly was happening?" The documents I found mentioned radio transmissions, behavioral modification. Frank cut her off with a sharp glance at Emma. Not in front of the child. Sarah nodded, understanding his concern. Emma, why don't you go sit in the living room for a few minutes while Mr. Cooper and I talk? Once Emma was out of earshot, Frank continued in a hushed tone. They found a frequency that influences neurochemistry, makes people more compliant, less questioning. Started as mind control research for the Cold War, but they discovered something else along the way. The effects became heritable. Children born to parents under long-term exposure showed increased susceptibility, even without direct exposure themselves. That's impossible, Sarah objected. Environmental influences can't change genetic inheritance. Epigenetics, Frank countered. Not changing the genes themselves, but how they're expressed. They've been fine-tuning it for decades. Meadowbrook is their perfect multi-generational laboratory. Isolated, stable population, minimal outside influence. Sarah thought about the strange compliance of Meadowbrook citizens, the lack of curiosity about a newcomer buying the old Jenkins place, the way even the county officials seemed to gloss over the unusual aspects of the property sale. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Why help me? Frank studied her intently. Because you're Richard Mitchell's granddaughter. I recognized the resemblance immediately. And if you're here now, it's not by accident. What do you mean? Richard Mitchell was the one who discovered the heritable effect. He was also the one who tried to shut the program down when he realized what they planned to do with it. They forced him out, made him disappear, but not before he built in a failsafe. Harold told me about it years ago, that someday someone from Mitchell's line would return, someone carrying the genetic resistance. Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed. This is insane. I came here because I was broke and desperate, not because of some genetic destiny. Did you? Frank asked quietly. Or were you guided here by something you don't yet understand? The frequency doesn't work on everyone, Ms. Mitchell. Some people are naturally resistant. Richard discovered that certain genetic markers provided immunity. His own family line carried those markers. He believed that someday one of his descendants would be drawn back here, someone with both the resistance and the intellect to finally expose what happened. Sarah thought of her inexplicable impulse to bid on the farm, the strange sense of familiarity she'd felt upon arriving, her daughter's immediate connection to the property. Even if that were true, she said, what am I supposed to do? I'm a single mum with barely enough money to fix a leaky roof, not some crusading whistleblower. These people have resources, power, decades of secrecy to protect. Frank reached across the table and grasped her hand. But you have something they don't, proof, and the right bloodline to make people listen. He paused. There's someone you need to meet, someone who's been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Who? Your grandmother Eleanor is still alive, Ms. Mitchell. Sarah stared at him in shock. That's impossible. My father told me she died before I was born. Another lie to keep you away from Meadowbrook, Frank said grimly. Eleanor Mitchell has been living under protection for 50 years, guarding the only complete record of what happened here, Richard's personal files and evidence. She couldn't come forward herself. They would have eliminated her immediately. But you, a previously unknown granddaughter showing up out of the blue, might have a chance. Where is she? About 2 hours from here. We need to leave now before those men secure the farm and realize what you've taken. Frank stood and grabbed his truck keys. Pack up your little girl. We're going on a road trip. As Frank prepared to leave, Sarah retrieved her canvas bag of evidence from the car and quickly looked through the items she had grabbed from the facility. The logbooks, data tapes, and photographs would provide concrete evidence of ongoing operations. But the most valuable piece might be the framed photo of her grandfather, proof of her connection to the project that would lend credibility to her claims. They piled into Frank's truck, Emma sleepy and confused in the back seat, and headed out on rural back roads to avoid main highways where they might be intercepted. "Those men will track you to my place soon enough," Frank said grimly. "But we've got a head start. If we're lucky, we'll reach Eleanor before they figure out where we're headed." As they drove through the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been a desperate single mother spending her last dollars on a dilapidated farm. Now she was fleeing government agents, carrying classified evidence, and heading to meet the grandmother she had believed dead her entire life. All because of a letter hidden beneath a barn floor, a letter that was about to bring the full attention of the highest levels of government down upon her head. "Not call him," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "Meet him. Thomas Reynolds has been monitoring Operation Echo from the shadows for years. He's been waiting for concrete evidence, something that would justify a full-scale investigation without tipping off the program's protectors." She moved to one of her filing cabinets and extracted a thick manila folder. This contains everything Richard documented before his death, including the original research that the Echo operatives believe was destroyed. Combined with what you've recovered from the facility, it's enough to force action. Sarah looked skeptically at her grandmother. "And you think the FBI director will just agree to meet with me? A random woman claiming to have evidence of a massive government conspiracy? He'll meet with you because I'll arrange it," Eleanor replied, gesturing toward the communication equipment along the wall. "I've maintained certain contacts over the decades, people who owe Richard and me for warning them about Echo, people in positions to get messages to those who need to hear them." Frank nodded in agreement. "Eleanor has been the silent guardian of this information for 50 years, waiting for the right moment. Your arrival at Cedar Ridge is that moment." Sarah glanced at Emma, who had been unusually quiet throughout the conversation. "This is a lot to process, especially for a 12-year-old. Emma straightened in her chair. "I'm not scared, Mom." "Well, I am, but not too scared to help. This is like in my books, the ones where kids discover something important and have to save everyone, except this is real." The simple courage in her daughter's voice nearly broke Sarah's heart. None of this was fair to Emma, who had already endured so much upheaval in her young life. But looking at her now, Sarah could see something she'd never fully appreciated before, a resilience and clarity of thought that perhaps came from the very genetic immunity her grandmother had described. "All right," Sarah said finally. "How do we arrange this meeting? And how do we know we can trust Director Reynolds?" "We don't know with absolute certainty," Eleanor admitted, "but Richard's research identified him as having the genetic markers for immunity. His career history shows consistent questioning of established narratives, and most importantly, he's been quietly investigating unusual patterns of behavior in government agencies for years. My contact reports that he's specifically interested in the Department of Energy's classified holdings in rural areas." Frank checked his watch. "If we're doing this, we need to move quickly. Those men at the farm will have reported by now. They'll be expanding their search, checking traffic cameras, putting out alerts." Eleanor nodded and turned to her computer. "I'll make contact with my intermediary. It will take a few hours to arrange a secure meeting." She looked up at Sarah. "In the meantime, you should go through everything you found, organize it, prepare to make your case concisely and compellingly. You may only get one chance." Ndiri. For the next several hours, Sarah immersed herself in the documents she'd taken from the facility and the additional materials Eleanor provided. Emma helped, surprisingly adept at organizing the papers chronologically and spotting connections between seemingly unrelated reports. The full picture that emerged was even more disturbing than Sarah had initially understood. Operation Echo had begun in 1951 as a straightforward mind control research program, testing whether radio frequencies could influence human behavior. Meadowbrook had been selected due to its geographic isolation and stable population. By 1958, researchers led by Richard Mitchell had discovered that prolonged exposure to certain frequencies produced subtle changes in neurochemistry, changes that appeared to be heritable. Children born to parents who had been subjected to the frequencies showed increased susceptibility to the same influences, even without direct exposure themselves. Richard's notes from 1962 expressed growing concern about the ethical implications and the government's interest in expanding the program. By 1965, he had confirmed that certain genetic profiles provided natural immunity, including his own family line. The later entries chronicled Richard's efforts to sabotage the project from within by providing flawed formulas while preserving the accurate research. His final entry, dated July 1968, outlined his fail-safe plan, a beacon system built into the Cedar Ridge facility that would remain dormant until activated by specific triggers, then emit a signal detectable only by those with both Mitchell, DNA, and the immunity markers. "He was brilliant," Sarah murmured, running her fingers over her grandfather's handwriting, decades ahead of his time in understanding epigenetic effects. "He was also pragmatic," Eleanor said, looking up from a computer. "He knew they would never let him simply walk away with what he knew. The sabotage bought us time. The beacon was our insurance." "How did it activate?" Sarah asked. "Why now, after all these years?" "The system was designed to activate when two conditions were met: when Echo reached the preparatory stages for nationwide implementation, and when a direct descendant of Richard's with the right genetic markers was in a position to act." Eleanor's eyes met Sarah's. "Your financial troubles, your desperate situation, those were real, but your awareness of the auction, your impulse to bid on that specific property despite all logical reasons not to, the beacon influenced those decisions subtly. The idea that her actions had been influenced by some dormant genetic signal was still difficult for Sarah to accept, but the evidence was compelling. The facility logs showed increased activity in the beacon system beginning approximately 6 months ago, right around the time Sarah's financial troubles had begun to mount. "I've made contact," Eleanor announced. "Director Reynolds has agreed to meet, but not here. Too risky. He suggested a neutral location, the Lakeside County Historical Society Museum. It's closed for renovations, but he can arrange private access. The meeting is set for 2 p.m. today." Frank checked his watch. "That gives us 3 hours. We should leave in 1 to be safe." "We'll take separate vehicles," Eleanor decided. "Frank and I in his truck, you and Emma in your car. Different routes to the meeting point. If either vehicle is intercepted, the other might still get through." Sarah nodded, appreciating the tactical thinking, even as she marveled at the surreal turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, her biggest concern had been how to tell Emma they couldn't afford new school clothes. Now, they were planning covert routes to a secret meeting with the FBI director about a decades-long government conspiracy. Eleanor packed Richard's research into a secure metal case while Sarah organized the materials she'd taken from the facility. They prepared duplicates of the most critical evidence, separating it between the 2 vehicles as a precaution. As they worked, Sarah noticed Emma studying the old photograph of Richard Mitchell standing with the original Echo research team. "He looks like you," Emma observed, around the eyes. Sarah smiled. "I guess he does. I wish I could have known him." "In many ways, you do know him," Eleanor said quietly. "You have his clarity of thought, his stubborn determination, and his moral compass." She hesitated, then added, "Your father inherited those qualities too, though he chose a different path to protect you." Why did my father tell me you were both dead? Sarah asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since Frank's revelation. Eleanor's composed expression faltered for the first time. Because we asked him to. It was the only way to keep you safe, to sever all connections to Meadowbrook, to the Mitchell name as it related to Cedar Ridge. If they had known about you, or she didn't finish the sentence. But they found me anyway, Sarah pointed out, when I bought the farm. They found an S. Mitchell who purchased a property, Eleanor corrected. Until you accessed the facility, they likely didn't know your exact connection. Now they do, which is why we must move quickly. Sarah thought about her father, the man who had been distant and preoccupied throughout her childhood, who had discouraged questions about family history, who had seemingly abandoned effort to know his granddaughter. Had it all been an act of protection rather than indifference? He's still alive, isn't he? She asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. In Tucson, living under another name. We maintain minimal contact. Coded messages through intermediaries, nothing. Directly traceable. All these years, Sarah murmured. All these secrets, necessary secrets, Frank interjected. You've seen what they're capable of, what they're planning to do. Before Sarah could respond, one of Eleanor's computers emitted a sharp alert. Eleanor moved quickly to check the screen, her expression darkening. We've been compromised, she announced, her voice calm despite the gravity of her words. Security cameras on the main road showed 2 black SUVs passing 20 minutes ago. They'll reach the turnoff to this location within 10 minutes. Frank was already moving, grabbing the packed evidence and heading for the door. We need to leave now. Split up as planned and head for the meeting point. Sarah gathered Emma and their belongings, her heart racing. How did they find us so quickly? They must have tracked your vehicle somehow, Eleanor said, rapidly shutting down her computers and initiating what appeared to be a data wiping sequence. Modern cars have GPS systems that can be remotely accessed with the right authorization. But how would they know to look for my grandmother's location? It's not like there are records connecting you to this place. Eleanor and Frank exchanged a quick glance that Sarah couldn't interpret. There's no time to explain now, Eleanor said. Take the east trail through the forest. It will bring you out on County Road 27, about 5 miles from the highway. Frank and I will take the main road as a decoy. They'll likely follow us, giving you a clear path. Sarah hesitated, suddenly, reluctant to separate. She had just found her grandmother after believing her dead for 36 years. The thought of losing her again was unexpectedly painful. Eleanor seemed to read her thoughts. She paused in her preparations and approached, Sarah placing her hands on her granddaughter's shoulders. For the first time, her carefully maintained composure softened. We will see each other again, she said firmly. You are stronger than you know, Sarah. You are a Mitchell, not just in name but in spirit. Get to the meeting. Show Director Reynolds what we've found. Finish what Richard started. She pulled Sarah into a brief, fierce hug, then stepped back, composure restored. Now go, every minute counts. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of the approaching threat. Sarah helped Emma into their car, which Frank had moved to the edge of the woods where a narrow dirt track led into the trees. This isn't a real road, Emma observed nervously as Sarah navigated the rough path, branches scraping against the windows. It's a logging trail, Sarah explained, concentrating on avoiding the worst ruts and fallen branches. Your great-grandmother said it will connect to a county road eventually. They drove in tense silence for several minutes, the car jolting over roots and rocks. Sarah checked the rearview mirror constantly, expecting to see headlights or hear the sound of pursuing vehicles, but the forest remained still. Mum, Emma said suddenly, do you think this immunity thing is real? That we can't be controlled by their radio signals? Sarah glanced at her daughter. "I don't know for certain, sweetheart. The evidence suggests it's possible. Why? Because if it's true, then we have to help, don't we? We're like the Resistance, like in Star Wars." Despite the gravity of their situation, Sarah couldn't help but smile at her daughter's framing of their predicament. "I suppose we are. Though I was hoping for fewer car chases and secret meetings in my life." The logging trail eventually widened and showed signs of more recent use. After about 15 minutes of careful driving, they emerged onto a paved road, County Road 27, just as Eleanor had described. Sarah checked her phone. No signal, which was both concerning and reassuring. It meant they couldn't call for help, but it also meant they couldn't be tracked through their cell phones. "Which way?" Emma asked. Sarah consulted the hastily drawn map Eleanor had provided. "East, to the right. It should take us toward the highway, but on a different route than Frank and Eleanor will be using." They drove in silence for several miles, the rural landscape passing in a blur of autumn colors. Sarah's mind raced with questions and contingency. Plans. What if Frank and Eleanor were captured? What if the meeting was a trap? What if the evidence wasn't enough to convince Director Reynolds? As they approached the highway intersection, Sarah spotted a gas station with a small convenience store. "We need fuel," she decided, pulling in, "and I want to check the news, see if there's anything about Cedar Ridge." The gas station was deserted, except for a bored teenage attendant who barely looked up from his phone as they entered. Sarah filled the tank, while Emma went inside to use the restroom and buy snacks for the remaining drive. While waiting, Sarah used the opportunity to inspect the car thoroughly, searching for anything that might have been used to track them. She found nothing obvious, but technology had advanced significantly since her college engineering courses. There could be GPS devices she wouldn't recognize. Inside the convenience store, a small television behind the counter was tuned to a local news channel. Sarah froze when she saw the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Fire at abandoned farm property in Meadowbrook under investigation." The attendant noticed her interest. "Crazy stuff, huh? They're saying it might be arson. Some old farm nobody cared about for years suddenly burns down the same day a new owner moves in." "The barn burned down?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Whole property from what they're saying. House, barn, everything. Fire. Department couldn't save any of it." He shrugged. "Probably insurance fraud or something." Sarah felt a chill run through her. The fire she had started as a distraction had been small, contained to the tractor's fuel tank. It shouldn't have. Spread to consume the entire property, unless someone had wanted to destroy evidence, to erase the facility beneath the barn, along with any traces of what had happened there. When Emma returned with an armful of snacks, Sarah hurried her back to the car, her sense of urgency renewed. If they were willing to burn down an entire farm to cover their tracks, what else might they do to prevent the truth from coming out? They reached the outskirts of Lakeside County just after 1:30 p.m., giving them 30 minutes to find the Historical Society Museum. The small town was quiet, with few people on the streets, a fact that Sarah found both reassuring and unsettling. The museum was located in a converted Victorian mansion on a tree-lined street near the town square. As Eleanor had described, it appeared closed for renovations, with construction barriers around the perimeter and no visible activity inside. Sarah parked a block away in the lot of a small park and studied the building carefully. "We'll approach on foot," she decided, "less conspicuous than driving right up." Emma nodded, her expression solemn. "Should we bring all the evidence?" "Just the essentials," Sarah replied, selecting the most compelling documents and photographs. "If this goes well, we can retrieve the rest later." They walked casually toward the museum, trying to appear like normal visitors enjoying the autumn afternoon. As they neared the building, Sarah noticed a side entrance partially obscured by scaffolding, just as Eleanor had described. "That's our way in," she murmured to Emma. "Stay close." They slipped through the construction barrier and approached the door. It was unlocked, opening silently to reveal a dimly lit corridor. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, suddenly acutely aware of how much they were risking on this meeting. If Eleanor's assessment of Director Reynolds was wrong, they were walking into a trap. "Should we really go in there?" Emma whispered, her earlier bravado faltering at the sight of the dark, empty building. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "Sometimes the right choice is also the scariest one. Remember what you said earlier about being the resistance? This is how we fight back, with truth." They entered the museum, closing the door quietly behind them. The corridor led to a grand staircase, its ornate banister draped with protective cloths. The renovation work appeared to be in its early stages, with tools and materials scattered throughout the first floor. "The meeting is in the main exhibition hall," Sarah said, recalling Eleanor's instructions. "Second floor, east wing." They climbed the stairs carefully, alert for any sounds that might indicate they weren't alone. The museum was eerily silent, their footsteps muffled by the drop cloths covering the floors. The exhibition hall was a large open space with high ceilings and tall windows currently covered with brown paper to protect them during renovation. Display cases had been pushed to the walls and covered, creating an open area in the center where a single table and 4 chairs had been placed. No one was there. Sarah checked her watch. 1:55 p.m. They were slightly early, but she had expected someone to be waiting. The empty room heightened her anxiety. "Maybe we should wait outside," Emma suggested, clearly uncomfortable. Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of a door opening somewhere on the floor below, followed by footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose. "Quick," Sarah whispered, pulling Emma behind a large covered display case. "Let's see who it is first." They crouched in the shadows, watching the entrance to the exhibition hall. Moments later, 3 figures appeared in the doorway. 2 were clearly security personnel, men in dark suits with earpieces and the unmistakable bulge of holstered weapons beneath their jackets. Between them stood a distinguished-looking man, in his early 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit. "Ms. Mitchell," he called, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hall. "I know you're here. I'm Thomas Reynolds, FBI Director. Eleanor Mitchell contacted me about your discovery at Cedar Ridge." Sarah hesitated, studying the man carefully. He matched the description Eleanor had provided, but the presence of the security detail made her cautious. "I understand your hesitation," Reynolds continued, as if reading her thoughts. "But I assure you, I'm here to help. These men are my personal security team, not connected to any other agency. They're here because we have reason to believe Echo operatives are already in the area." Something in his tone, a directness, a lack of the usual bureaucratic caution, resonated with Sarah. Making a decision, she stood, keeping Emma slightly behind her. "Director Reynolds," she acknowledged, stepping out from their hiding place. "I apologize for the caution. It's been an eventful few days." Reynolds nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "I imagine it has. Finding an illegal government research facility beneath your new barn would qualify as eventful by anyone's standards." His expression turned serious. "I received Eleanor's message about the fire. I'm sorry about your property. You've been in contact with my grandmother directly. Is she safe?" "As of 30 minutes ago, yes. She and Mr. Cooper successfully diverted the Echo security team, then split up to make tracking more difficult. Eleanor is making her way here by an alternate route," Relief washed over Sarah. At least part of their plan had worked. Reynolds gestured to the table. "We don't have much time. I need to see what you've found, specifically anything relating to the current implementation timeline." As they approached the table, one of the security men spoke quietly into his wrist microphone, then addressed Reynolds. "Sir, we have movement on the perimeter. 2 vehicles, standard government issue." Reynolds frowned. "Already? That's faster than expected." "Secure the entrances. Standard containment protocol." He turned to Sarah. "We need to work quickly." Sarah spread out the documents she had brought, the recent logbooks, photographs of the facility, and the crucial pages from Richard Mitchell's research detailing the genetic aspects of Echo's effects. Reynolds examined them with the efficiency of someone accustomed to processing complex information rapidly. "This confirms our suspicions," he said after a few minutes. "Echo has been restructured as a black program outside normal oversight channels. The transmission network is nearly complete." "But why?" Sarah asked. "What's the ultimate goal?" Reynolds looked up, his expression grave. "Control without the appearance of coercion. The perfect system of governance from certain perspectives. A population that believes it's making free choices while actually responding to subtle influence. No need for overt force, no resistance to overcome." "That's horrifying," Sarah said. "It's also nearly operational," Reynolds replied. "According to these logs, Phase 7 nationwide implementation is scheduled for activation within 30 days. Once it's active, identifying and countering it becomes exponentially more difficult." One of the security men returned, his expression tense. "Sir, we have a situation. Echo security teams have established a perimeter around the building. They're preparing to enter." Reynolds cursed under his breath. "How many?" "At least 8 that we can see. Likely more in reserve." "How did they find us?" Sarah asked, gathering Emma closer protectively. "The most likely explanation is that someone on Eleanor's contact chain is compromised," Reynolds said grimly. "Echo has had decades to place their people in key positions." He turned to his security man. "Initiate protocol blackout, full communications shutdown, prepare for extraction via Route C." The man nodded and left quickly, speaking urgently into his communication device. "What about my grandmother?" Sarah asked. "If she's on her way here..." "Eleanor Mitchell has survived 50 years of Echo surveillance," Reynolds replied. "She'll recognize the danger and adapt accordingly." He began gathering the documents Sarah had brought. "We need to move these to a secure location immediately. Once Echo operatives confirm what you found, they'll stop at nothing to contain the information." "Contain the information or contain us?" Sarah asked quietly, glancing at Emma. Reynolds met her gaze directly. "Both. The existence of genetic immunity to their techniques is perhaps their most closely guarded secret. The fact that you and your daughter carry those markers makes you particularly valuable and particularly dangerous to their program." Abdul, the second security man, returned, his expression urgent. "Sir, they're moving in. We have maybe 3 minutes before they breach the building." Reynolds nodded and turned to Sarah. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to get you and your daughter to safety, along with this evidence. My security team has a protocol for exactly this scenario, but you'll need to trust me completely and follow my instructions without question. Can you do that?" Sarah glanced at Emma, who looked frightened but resolute. She thought about everything that had happened since she purchased Cedar Ridge Farm. The hidden facility, the family secrets, the genetic legacy she hadn't known she carried. She thought about her grandfather's brilliant foresight and her grandmother's decades of vigilance. Most of all, she thought about what would happen if Echo succeeded, if the entire nation fell under the subtle control of frequencies designed to suppress questioning and independent thought. "Yes," she said firmly. "We'll do whatever is necessary." Reynolds nodded, a look of respect crossing his features. Then let's move. We have a secure facility where you'll be protected while we prepare the case against Echo. Getting there won't be easy, but I promise you this: your grandfather's work will not have been in vain. As they hurried from the exhibition hall, following Reynolds and his security team toward a service elevator at the rear of the building, Sarah realized that her desperate purchase of a failing farm hadn't just changed her life. It had set in motion events that might change the course of the nation itself. The letter hidden beneath the barn floor had indeed brought the FBI director to her door, but what happened next would determine whether that letter would open the door to truth or seal them all in darkness. Pastor Wilson led Sarah to a small door concealed behind an ornate tapestry. It opened to reveal a narrow staircase descending beneath the church. During Prohibition, this church served as more than a place of worship, Wilson explained, as they descended the worn stone steps. The basement was used as a way station for those smuggling liquor across state lines. Later, during the Cold War, it was converted to a fallout shelter. Few remember its existence now. The staircase opened into a surprisingly large underground room, well lit and furnished with basic amenities. Cots, a small kitchenette, communications equipment, and most surprisingly, several computer workstations. We've maintained this space as a safe house for those affected by Echo, Wilson said, noting Sarah's surprised expression. Over the decades, we've helped dozens of people who began asking questions, who noticed the patterns of influence in Meadowbrook and surrounding areas. You've been fighting Echo all this time, Sarah asked, taking in the unexpected resistance headquarters. Wilson smiled. Fighting is perhaps too strong a word. Observing, documenting, providing safe passage for those who needed to escape. But yes, we've been aware of their activities since the early days. A wall of photographs caught Sarah's attention. Faces of different ages and backgrounds, all with names and dates carefully noted beneath them. The immune, Wilson explained. People who, for whatever reason, remained unaffected by Echo's frequencies. We've helped them relocate, establish new identities when necessary. Sarah approached the wall, studying the faces. Some of the photographs dated back to the 1960s, creating a historical record of resistance spanning generations. There, Wilson said, pointing to a photograph near the center of the display. Your grandfather. The image showed a younger Richard Mitchell than in the facility photographs, perhaps in his early 40s, standing with a small group outside the very church they were now in. The date beneath it read July 1971, 3 years after his supposed death, according to the official records. He didn't die, Sarah whispered. Not when they claimed, Wilson confirmed. After sabotaging Echo from within, Richard went underground. He worked with our network for almost 15 years, helping to identify other immune individuals and creating countermeasures against the frequencies. Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she'd learned. My grandmother never told me. She let me believe he died before I was born. Secrecy was essential to protect both of you, Wilson said. Gently, the fewer people who knew the truth, the safer everyone remained. Before Sarah could ask more questions, the door at the top of the stairs opened. She tensed, relaxing only when she saw Emma being escorted by a young man who must have been Wilson's assistant. "Mom!" Emma cried, rushing down the stairs and into Sarah's arms. I was so scared when that man came into the bakery looking for us. Sarah held her daughter tightly. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, but you did exactly right. You stayed hidden, just like I asked." The Echo operative entered the bakery approximately 10 minutes ago, the young assistant reported to Wilson. I retrieved the girl through the back entrance as he was questioning the staff at the front. Wilson nodded in approval. "Well done, Michael. Any sign of Director Reynolds or his team?" None yet, sir. But there's increased activity around the town square. Police vehicles, unmarked cars. It appears a significant search operation is underway. Wilson's expression grew concerned. They're committing substantial resources. That suggests Reynolds was either captured or they believe. He passed significant materials to Sarah before they separated. Indeed, and the implications sent a chill through Sarah. If Reynolds had been captured, their chances of safely reaching his secure facility had just plummeted. And if Echo operatives were expanding their search perimeter, it was only a matter of time before they began checking local buildings, including the church. "What now?" she asked, keeping her arm protectively around Emma's shoulders. Wilson moved to one of the computer workstations and began typing rapidly. "We implement contingency protocols. Reynolds and I have worked together for years. He anticipated the possibility of interference and established alternate extraction routes." The screen displayed what appeared to be a secure messaging system. Wilson typed a brief encoded message, then waited. After nearly a minute of tense silence, a response appeared. "Good news," Wilson announced. "Reynolds is secure. He evaded capture and has reached the secondary extraction point. However, he cannot return to town without risking exposure." He turned to Sarah. "That means we need to get you and Emma to him." "How?" "The town is crawling with Echo operatives." Wilson smiled faintly. "The same way we've moved people for decades, beneath their notice." He gestured to Michael. "Prepare the parish van and the standard misdirection package." While Michael hurried to comply, Wilson retrieved a locked cabinet key from around his neck. Inside the cabinet were various identity documents, driver's licenses, passports, birth certificates, all appearing convincingly authentic. Echo relies heavily on technology and official channels to track targets, Wilson explained as he selected several items. Their weakness is that they discount the effectiveness of simple, low-tech solutions. He handed Sarah and Emma each a folder. New temporary identities, just enough to get you through checkpoints if necessary. Sarah opened her folder to find a driver's license with her photograph, but the name Margaret Wilson and an address in Minneapolis. Emma's folder contained a school ID with the name Lily Wilson. "You'll be my niece and her daughter, visiting from Minnesota," Wilson explained, putting on a clerical collar. "Michael will drive us in the church van to a rendezvous point 20 miles outside town. From there, Reynolds' team will take you the rest of the way." "Won't they be watching all vehicles leaving town?" Sarah asked. "Most of them, yes," Wilson acknowledged. "That's where the misdirection comes in." Michael returned, carrying several grocery bags and what appeared to be church event supplies. "The van is ready, Pastor. I've implemented Protocol Sundown." Wilson nodded in approval. "Protocol Sundown is one of our more effective techniques," he explained to Sarah. "In approximately 5 minutes, reports will begin coming in of a woman and child matching your descriptions being seen in the north end of the county, heading toward the state line. Several of our network members will ensure these sightings appear credible." "While we slip out in the opposite direction," Sarah finished, beginning to understand the sophistication of their operation. "Precisely. Now we don't have much time. You'll need to change your appearances. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create doubt during a casual inspection." From one of the bags, Michael produced hair accessories, glasses, and simple clothing items. Within 10 minutes, Sarah's distinctive auburn hair was covered by a headscarf, and Emma's long brown hair was pulled back into a style different from her usual one. Both wore glasses that subtly altered the appearance of their faces. "The human brain relies heavily on key facial features and hair for quick identification," Wilson explained as they prepared. "These simple changes force observers to look more carefully, which most won't bother to do if they're scanning crowds quickly." Sarah was impressed by the thoroughness of their preparations. "You've clearly done this before." "More times than I care to remember," Wilson replied with a touch of sadness. "Each person we help is a small victory, but the larger battle has continued for too long." He checked his watch. "It's time. The diversionary report should be circulating now, drawing resources to the north. Our window of opportunity is opening." They ascended the stairs and exited through a side door of the church, where an ordinary-looking white van with First Covenant Church Community Outreach painted on the side waited in the small parking lot. Michael loaded the grocery bags and supplies, while Wilson helped Sarah and Emma into the back seats. "Remember," Wilson instructed as he took the passenger seat, "if we're stopped, you're Margaret and Lily Wilson from Minneapolis, here visiting your uncle. You're helping with the church's food pantry deliveries this afternoon. Let me do most of the talking." The van pulled out of the church parking lot and proceeded at a normal, unhurried pace through town. Sarah tensed as they passed two police vehicles parked at an intersection, but the officers barely glanced at the church van. "They're looking for individuals on foot or in private vehicles," Wilson explained quietly. "A church van with an elderly pastor rarely triggers scrutiny." They navigated through the small town without incident, eventually reaching the outskirts where houses gave way to farmland. Sarah began to breathe more easily as they put distance between themselves and Lakeside County. "How much further to the rendezvous point?" she asked after they had been driving for about 15 minutes. "Another few miles," Wilson replied. "There's an abandoned grain silo that serves as our transfer location. Reynolds' team should—" He stopped abruptly as Michael tensed, his attention fixed on the rearview mirror. "We have a vehicle following us. Black SUV, maintaining consistent distance for the past 3 minutes." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. She resisted the urge to turn and look, instead keeping her eyes forward as she had been instructed. "Coincidence, perhaps," Wilson said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Take the next right turn. Let's see if they follow." Michael complied, turning the van onto a less-traveled county road. The SUV turned as well, maintaining the same distance. "Definitely following," Michael confirmed grimly. "They must have identified the van somehow." Wilson's expression remained calm, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. "Implement protocol crossroads." Michael nodded and accelerated slightly, taking the next left turn onto an even smaller road that appeared to lead toward a cluster of farm buildings in the distance. "What's protocol crossroads?" Sarah asked quietly. "A contingency for when direct evasion is impossible," Wilson explained. "We're changing the rendezvous point and splitting up. There's a network safe house at that farm ahead. Michael will create a diversion while you, Emma, and I proceed on foot to an alternate pickup location." As they approached the farm, Sarah could see it was larger than it had appeared from a distance. A main house, several outbuildings, and extensive fields currently being harvested by large combines. Workers moved about the property, creating a scene of normal agricultural activity. Michael drove directly to the main house and parked. "The family here is part of our network," Wilson explained quickly. "They've been helping people evade Echo for 2 generations. Follow my lead and act natural." They exited the van, Wilson carrying one of the grocery bags as if making a routine delivery. A middle-aged woman appeared on the porch, immediately assessing the situation with a practiced eye. "Pastor Wilson," she called warmly, "so good of you to bring those donations by. And you've brought helpers today." "Indeed I have, Martha," Wilson replied, matching her casual tone. "My niece Margaret and her daughter Lily are visiting from Minneapolis." The woman nodded almost imperceptibly, then gestured toward the house. "Come in, all of you. I just put on a fresh pot of coffee." Day. As they climbed the porch steps, Sarah glanced back to see the black SUV passing slowly on the road, the driver clearly observing the farm. It continued past without stopping, but Sarah had no doubt they would circle back once they realized they'd lost visual contact with their targets. Inside the farmhouse, the friendly atmosphere immediately shifted to efficient action. Martha led them through the kitchen to what appeared to be a storage pantry, but when she pulled on a specific shelf, the entire unit swung outward to reveal a hidden passage. "The tunnel leads to the equipment barn," she explained quickly. "John is waiting with the tractor. He'll get you to the northeast field where the helicopter can land without being seen from the road." "Helicopter," Sarah echoed. "Reynolds' extraction team," Wilson confirmed. "They'll be using agricultural flight patterns as cover. Crop dusters and survey aircraft are common in this area." Michael remained behind to provide the diversion they had mentioned, driving the van away from the farm in a direction that would draw pursuit. Martha quickly closed the hidden door behind them, leaving Sarah, Emma, and Wilson to navigate the dimly lit underground passage. "This tunnel was originally built during Prohibition," Wilson explained as they hurried along. "Like many farms. In this region, this one has a history of quietly resisting government overreach." The tunnel extended for perhaps 100 yards before ending at a ladder that led up to what appeared to be the floor of a barn. Wilson climbed first, then helped Sarah and Emma up through the opening. The equipment barn was massive, filled with tractors, combines, and other farm machinery. A bearded man in overalls, presumably John, was waiting beside a large tractor with an enclosed cab and a flatbed trailer attached. "They're watching the roads," he said without preamble. "2 vehicles, coordinating to cover all farm exits. But they don't know about the old creek crossing." Wilson nodded. "Perfect. How long until Reynolds' team can land?" 20 minutes, John replied, checking his watch. "They're maintaining normal agricultural flight patterns until the last moment to avoid triggering alerts." He helped them onto the trailer and covered them with what appeared to be empty grain sacks, but which Sarah soon realized were specially designed camouflage covers with reflective material that would confuse thermal imaging. "Echo uses infrared scanners from their vehicles," John explained, noticing her surprised expression. "These will mask your heat signatures enough to get past casual scanning." The tractor rumbled to life, its diesel engine drowning out any conversation as John drove them out of the barn and across the farm property. Through a small gap in the U-team covers, Sarah could see they were headed away from the main road toward a wooded area that presumably concealed the creek John had mentioned. Emma pressed close to her side, eyes wide but no longer showing fear. Instead, there was a sort of determined fascination in her expression. "This is like a spy movie," she whispered, "but real." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "You're being incredibly brave. I'm so proud of you." The tractor slowed as they entered the woods, following what appeared to be an ancient, overgrown track that probably predated the modern roads. The going was rough, the trailer bouncing over roots and rocks, but John navigated with the confidence of someone who had traveled this route many times before. After about 10 minutes, they reached a shallow creek. Instead of crossing immediately, John stopped the tractor and switched off the engine. "We wait here," Wilson explained quietly. "The helicopter will land in the clearing on the other side. Better to minimize our time in the open." Sarah checked her watch nervously. The sun would be setting soon, which would provide additional cover but might also complicate the helicopter landing. Every minute they delayed increased the risk of Echo operatives expanding their search perimeter to include this remote area. Wilson seemed to read her thoughts. "The timing is precise," he assured her. "Reynolds' team will create several diversionary aircraft sightings elsewhere in the county exactly 7 minutes before the actual extraction helicopter approaches. It's a technique we've refined over many operations." "How long has your network been doing this?" Sarah asked. impressed by the level of organization. "Since 1972, Wilson replied. "After your grandfather went underground, he helped establish protocols for identifying and extracting those who showed immunity to Echo's influence. Over the decades, the network has grown, adapted, incorporated new technologies while maintaining low-tech backups." He looked at Sarah with unexpected intensity. Richard believed that someday, when the time was right, someone would come who could finally expose the truth about Echo. Someone with both the immunity and the credibility to be believed. "I believe you may be that person, Sarah." Before she could respond, the distant sound of helicopter rotors became audible, growing steadily louder. John immediately restarted the tractor and continued across the creek, emerging into a small clearing just large enough for a helicopter to land. As they watched, a black helicopter appeared over the tree line, its markings suggesting a private agricultural survey company. It descended rapidly, touching down in the center of the clearing with practiced precision. The side door slid open to reveal one of Reynolds' security men, gesturing urgently for them to approach. John drove the tractor directly to the helicopter, positioning the trailer for quick transfer. "Quickly!" the security man shouted over the rotor noise. "Echo units have expanded their search perimeter. They'll have detected the helicopter despite our countermeasures." Sarah and Emma scrambled from beneath their covers and ran to the helicopter, Wilson following close behind. As they reached the door, Sarah turned to thank the pastor, but he made no move to board. "You're not coming?" she asked, suddenly reluctant to leave the man who had risked so much to help them. Wilson shook his head. "My place is here, continuing the work. There are others who will need our help, especially once you expose Echo's program." He pressed something into her hand, a small flash drive. "Additional evidence collected over decades. Use it wisely." The security man was growing increasingly urgent. "Now, Ms. Mitchell, we have multiple vehicles converging on this location." Sarah impulsively hugged Wilson. "Thank you for everything." "Good luck," he replied simply, then stepped back as Sarah and Emma boarded the helicopter. The door had barely closed when the pilot lifted off, the aircraft rapidly gaining altitude and banking sharply to the east. Through the window, Sarah could see John and Wilson already returning to the tractor, preparing to depart before Echo operatives reached the clearing. "Director Reynolds is waiting at our secure facility," the security man informed them as they strapped in. "The flight will take approximately 90 minutes. "Is he all right?" Sarah asked. "We heard there was a confrontation in town." "Minor injuries only," the man assured her. "The director is more concerned about you and your daughter. Did you manage to preserve the evidence?" Sarah patted her bag, which still contained the most crucial documents she'd taken from the Cedar Ridge facility, and held up the flash drive Wilson had given her. "Everything's here, plus additional documentation from Pastor Wilson's network." The security man nodded in satisfaction. "Excellent. The director has already initiated preliminary protocols based on what you discovered at Cedar Ridge. With the complete evidence package, we can move to the next phase." As the helicopter flew east, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. 3 days ago, she had been a desperate single mother, spending her last dollars on a dilapidated farm. Now she was flying in a black helicopter with classified evidence that could expose a decades-long government mind control program. "Mom," Emma's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "What happens when we land? Will we ever go back to our farm?" Sarah pulled her daughter close. "I don't know exactly what happens next, sweetheart, but I don't think we'll be going back to Cedar Ridge, at least not anytime soon. From what we've learned, that property wasn't really meant to be our home. It was more like a doorway we needed to pass through." "Because of Great-Grandpa's beacon thing? The genetic calling?" Sarah smiled at her daughter's quick understanding. "Yes, exactly. Your great-grandfather left that beacon knowing someday one of his descendants would be in the right place at the right time to find it. That turned out to be us." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. "So, we're special. Because we have the immunity. We're different," Sarah corrected gently. "And with that difference comes responsibility. We can see what others can't, which means we have an obligation to help them." The helicopter continued eastward as darkness fell, the landscape below, transforming into a patchwork of lights marking towns and highways. After about an hour, they began descending toward what appeared to be a private estate in a heavily wooded area. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," the security man said as they approached. "One of the few truly secure facilities remaining outside Echo's influence." The helicopter landed on a pad adjacent to a large colonial-style mansion surrounded by extensive grounds. As the rotors wound down, Sarah could see armed guards positioned discreetly around the perimeter and what appeared to be sophisticated surveillance equipment integrated into the landscaping. Director Reynolds was waiting as they deplaned, his arm in a sling but otherwise appearing unharmed. His face showed visible relief at their arrival. "Ms. Mitchell, Emma," he greeted them. "Thank you for trusting us. I know the journey hasn't been easy." "Easier than staying would have been," Sarah replied, shaking his outstretched hand. "I understand you were injured, helping us escape." Reynolds dismissed this with a gesture, a minor inconvenience compared to what was at stake. He led them toward the mansion. "We have secure accommodations prepared for you both. After you've had a chance to rest and refresh, we can begin the formal debriefing and evidence review." The interior of the mansion had been converted into what appeared to be a high-tech intelligence operations center. Staff moved purposefully between workstations, while wall screens displayed news feeds, surveillance footage, and data streams. Yet despite the advanced technology, Sarah noticed touches of elegant, old-world craftsmanship in the architecture and furnishings. Oak Ridge was established in 1982 as an off-books continuity of government facility, Reynolds explained as they walked. After certain officials became concerned about Echo's growing influence, it was quietly repurposed as a base for monitoring and eventually countering their activities. He led them to a comfortable suite of rooms on the second floor, where clothing, toiletries, and a hot meal awaited them. "Please make yourselves at home. Security is comprehensive. You're completely safe here. We'll reconvene in the morning to discuss next steps." After Reynolds departed, Sarah and Emma explored their new accommodations. A sitting room, 2 bedrooms, and a modern bathroom, all tastefully furnished and apparently designed for long-term stays. "Are we going to live here now?" Emma asked, testing the softness of her bed. "For a little while, I think," Sarah replied, "until we figure out what happens next with all the evidence we found." They ate the provided meal gratefully. It had been many hours since their last proper food, and then Emma, exhausted by the day's events, fell asleep almost immediately after showering. Sarah remained awake, too wired to sleep, despite her physical exhaustion. She sat by the window of their suite, looking out at the moonlit grounds of Oak Ridge, trying to process everything that had happened since she'd purchased Cedar Ridge Farm. Her grandmother Eleanor was alive. Her grandfather had survived long past his official death date. Her father had been protecting her through his absence, and she herself had been drawn to that specific property by some kind of genetic beacon her grandfather had created decades before her birth. It seemed impossibly fantastic, the stuff of science fiction rather than reality. Yet, the evidence was undeniable, from the underground facility to the documents in her possession, to the very fact that she was now in a secret compound under FBI protection. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found Director Reynolds standing in the hallway, his expression grave. "I apologize for disturbing you, Ms. Mitchell, but there's been a development you should know about." He entered the suite, carefully closing the door behind him. "We've just received word that Echo operatives have taken your grandmother, Eleanor Mitchell, into custody." Sarah felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. "How? When?" "Approximately 2 hours ago. She was en route to a secondary safe house after successfully diverting the team that pursued you from Cedar Ridge." Reynolds' face showed genuine regret. "I'm deeply sorry. Eleanor Mitchell has been a cornerstone of resistance against Echo for 50 years. Her capture represents a significant setback. Can we help her, rescue her?" Reynolds sighed. "Echo will have taken her to one of their secure facilities, locations we've been trying to identify for years. However," he hesitated, then continued with clear reluctance, "Eleanor has always maintained that if she were ever captured, we should not attempt rescue. Her knowledge of our network is too extensive. Any failed attempt would risk exposing dozens of other operatives." True, Sarah sank into a chair, the weight of this news compounding her already overwhelming situation. "So, we just abandon her?" "Not abandon," Reynolds corrected firmly. "We accelerate our timeline. The evidence you've provided, combined with what we've gathered over the years, gives us the leverage to finally bring Echo into the light. That was always Eleanor's goal, exposure rather than confrontation." He sat across from Sarah, his expression intensely focused. "Tomorrow morning I plan to brief the president directly, using secure channels that bypass potentially compromised officials. With your testimony and the documented evidence, we can force immediate congressional oversight and suspension of Echo's operations." "And you think that will work? After 70 years of secrecy?" "It has to," Reynolds replied simply. "The alternative is allowing Phase 7 to proceed, nationwide implementation of influence frequencies that would fundamentally alter the nature of democratic choice in this country." He stood, his determination evident in every movement despite his injury. "Get some rest, Ms. Mitchell. Tomorrow you'll help us change history." After Reynolds left, Sarah returned to the window, her mind racing with fresh concerns about her grandmother and the enormity of what lay ahead. The single mother, who had desperately purchased a failing farm at auction, was now poised to expose one of the government's most classified and ethically problematic programs, all because of a letter hidden beneath a barn floor decades ago. She thought about her grandfather, the brilliant scientist who had recognized the danger in his own creation and worked to ensure it could someday be stopped. She thought about her grandmother, who had maintained vigilance for 50 years, protecting the truth until the right moment arrived. She thought about Pastor Wilson and his network, quietly resisting influence and helping others escape for generations. And she thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in the next room, a child carrying the genetic immunity that made her a threat to those who would control rather than persuade. Emma represented the future that all these people had fought to protect. Oh, future where choices remained truly free. As dawn broke over Oak Ridge, Sarah Mitchell made a promise to herself and to all those who had sacrificed for this moment. She would see this through. She would tell the truth, no matter the personal cost. She would finish what her grandfather had started. The letter that had brought the FBI director to her door would now bring the truth to the nation's highest offices. And perhaps in that truth, there would finally be justice, not just for her family, but for every citizen whose thoughts and choices had been subtly manipulated without their knowledge or consent. She had lost a farm, but found a purpose. And in that purpose, Sarah discovered something she had been missing far longer than financial security, a sense of belonging to something larger than herself, a legacy worth upholding, and a future worth fighting for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.